exchange of views on recent human rights developments in Russia, and I'm very happy to be in this joint meeting with the AFET committee on this particular issue. This is an AFET DOA meeting on Russia. That's what we are doing today. And we're also meeting together with the European Parliament's delegation for relations with Russia. So with the help of experts, we're going to be looking at the deteriorating human rights situation in Russia in the context of the brutal repression of the ongoing manifestations against the arbitrary arrest and jailing of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Of course, I don't need to tell you that the situation is extremely worrying. We are seeing huge detentions of people. All they were doing was exercising their right to peaceful assembly and to freedom of expression. So there are large-scale protests ongoing across Russia. More than 5,000 protesters have been detained across the country, most of them in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Many of those who have been arrested are being held in inhumane conditions. We in the European Parliament, in our recent resolution of the 21st of January, strongly condemn the behaviour of the Russian authorities. It's inappropriate for a member of the Council of Europe and the OSCE to breach a law that's enshrined in the ECHR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We have also called on the Council to strengthen the EU's existing restrictive measures vis-à-vis Russia and impose additional targeted restricted measures under the new EU global human rights sanctions regime against all individuals who were or are involved in or bear responsibility for the attacks against Alexei Navalny. We have two speakers with us today. First of all, we'll be hearing from Ms. Sasha Kulaeva, who is a lecturer in human rights at the Paris School of International Affairs of Sciences Po. But many of you will remember her from a previous position of the director of the Eastern European Bureau in FIDH. We will then hear from a representative of OVD Info. This is a platform that was launched in 2011 as a means of quickly monitoring arrests during mass protests, and has now evolved into a full-scale analytical project dealing with law enforcement issues in Russia. Then we will hear from Ms. Odrone Perkauskine, who is the head of division for Russia at the European External Action Service, and she will be telling us more about High Representative Vice President Josep Borrell's ongoing visit to Moscow and any immediate reactions planned by the European Union. I will also be giving the floor, before we hear from our guests, to my colleague, Mr. Ryszard Czarnecki, who is the chair of the European Parliament's delegation for relations with the Russian Federation. I would also like to give the floor to my colleague, Jelena Tsovko, given that she is chairing this on the AFET side.
Is Mr. Czarnecki connected? If yes, we give him the floor. If not, we give the floor to Janina Zovko. So we don't see Mr. Czarnecki, so I give the floor to Janina.
Thank you very much, Maria. Arena, the large numbers of citizens participating in the recent demonstration in Russia is unprecedented. Since 2011 protests, which followed the flawed parliamentary elections, we have not witnessed something similar. This time, however, the demonstrations are spread all over the huge Russian territory and not just in its biggest cities. Furthermore, the participants in these peaceful demonstrations are persons of all types and origins. They are simply citizens tired and frustrated of a political system that does not allow dissidence or freedoms, and that its main purpose is to defend survival in the power of President Putin and the politico-economic elite that surrounds him. The authorities tightly control the media, and the news that the citizens received are not reliable. Regretfully, the Russian parliament is faithfully following this repressive trend, adopting legislations to implement strictly the constitutional amendments of the last year, which were done fitting the Kremlin's plans and narratives. Moreover, the activities of the civil society are constantly diminished, with the loss of the so-called foreign agents and undesirable organizations and individuals. Alexei Navalny's hard prison sentence, the strong police repression to the protesters, and the high number of citizens detained show that this time the Kremlin feels insecure. Contrary to the Kremlin's narrative, the West is neither behind the protest nor behind any conspiracy seeking a regime change. The demonstrations are simply a popular reaction to an unfair punishment applied to a dissident who has now become a leader. Moreover, the Kremlin and the official media will try and keep denying it, and all corruption allegations, and the people know that many of them are true. The key question is how to deal with Russia under these conditions. We want stability in our continent as much as the Kremlin wants, but we cannot renounce to our core values. Democracy and fundamental freedoms need to be the basis for further fruitful and stable EU-Russia relations. We must ensure from the Parliament that our Member States maintain their unified position on sanctions. We must also ensure that all EU's and Member States' institutions strictly respect the 5 guiding principles on our relations with Russia described in the EU Global Security Strategy. So now I will give the floor to Ms. Sasha Kovaleva, a lecturer in Human Rights, School of International Affairs of Sciences Po Paris. Madam Kovaleva, you have the floor for maximum 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. I will take this opportunity to address the situation in Russia, and I'm very happy that my intervention will be followed by the direct witnessing from Moscow from our colleagues from OVD Info, which was indeed the group which monitored these last days and weeks with a great precision what was happening in Russia, and permitted the media also to have a very exact record of what was happening. You mentioned, Mrs. President, the case of Alexei Navalny, which is, of course, is now in the light spot of all the media and the attention of international community. However, the court's decision to imprison him is, in my eyes, not only the litmus test or a trigger, but also a screenshot of what is happening in Russia more globally. This decision is indeed politically motivated and totally arbitrary. It has nothing to do with law, and the worrying sign for us who were witnessing what was happening in Russia for the last couple of decades already, the new thing is that there is no attempt of the power to hide between any legal procedures or to make them trusted or believed. This judgment directly and obviously violates the Russian Federation law, the Russian Federation's obligations under the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. It violates the European Court of Human Rights decision, which is already valid in terms of violation of Article 6 and 7. It violates human sense. And that is among the factors which brought to the streets so many people who were not just following a leader or an appeal to demonstrate, who were protesting against this absolutely flagrant violation of everything, and including the human common sense. The repressive measures are only a new stage. The measures which we observed these last weeks are only a new stage in the most powerful campaign of intimidation against Russian civil society of recent decades. And unfortunately, we had a chance to see many other campaigns. This one is really extraordinary. It started late 2020 with the adoption or proposal of the package of new legislations. This is also nothing new, but these legislations go far beyond everything we could observe before. That's why also these people went to the streets, and 11,000 of them were detained during the large-scale protests of 23rd of January, 31st of January, and 2nd of February. We also see that it didn't stop there. It continues even now. Police is coming to look for journalists, for activists, even though some of them never went out to demonstrate. Like the editor-in-chief of one of the best outlets covering the protests and police violence and shortcomings, Mr. Smirnov, who was detained and condemned to 25 days in prison, although he was even not taking part in, in actual protests. So authorities often cite a lack of official approval for the demonstrations, which is true, but this cannot be a justification of police violence of this scale in any case, especially because all of these demonstrations were perfectly peaceful, and the use of force and violence, and my colleagues from OVD Info will talk about that in more details, is absolutely unprecedented even for Russian police during the demonstrations. Furthermore, the Russian authorities used the COVID-19 epidemic as a pretext to ban public protests, but also to bring some criminal cases against the activists around the dates they were expecting these activists to take part in the demonstrations. There is this famous sanitary case, criminal case now, which is threatening dozens of people with very tough measures, although the 11,000 of detainees were put all together without any sanitary requirements to the centers, which were even not adopted to receive so many people. And I hope we will also hear some updates from our colleagues on that from the ground. But from what I heard, some 30 people stay in the room, which is meant for 4 or 8. They have no beds. They have no most simple, decent living conditions. And some of them have spent 20 to 40 hours in the buses, which were expecting outside to be admitted to the detention facilities, because the amount of people arrested or detained was absolutely exceeding the capacities of the detention centers. So some of them are taken hundreds of kilometers away from their families, lawyers, and support groups. Finally, the draft laws, which I already mentioned, and which are now or very soon entering into force, amend the legislation which regulate the activities of non-governmental, non-profit organizations, but also individuals, mass media, organizations which can conduct any kind of public events, measures to protect state secrets or counter security threats. It introduced administrative and criminal liability for non-compliance with these new norms. And basically, in a very intrusive form, it goes in all the spheres of public and personal life, including family. And I would like to really strongly underline that in terms of the protests, we have these numbers, we have this 11,000 people detained, we have torture and criminal cases. We know that some people were tortured just to give the password to their phone, for instance, although it was just a person who was detained during the demonstration and not suspected of any criminal activities or whatsoever. We also have some minors, quite some minors, who were arrested during these events, and some of them, as this girl from St. Petersburg, who is 11 years old, had nothing to do with the demonstration. They were just on the street. Now her mother is threatened to lose her paternity rights because her daughter was detained with the protesters during the protests. But we also have the orders from the employers who threaten people working for them with all kinds of sanctions because of going out to the streets. We have school kids who are persecuted upon and pressured, psychologically pressured in schools in order to make sure they don't take part in any political activity. Some people are arrested for tweets. Some people are arrested for retweets. Some people are arrested for jokes about the tweets, which is the case of Mr. Smirnov, the editor-in-chief of Media Zona. So that brings me back to the point I made in the very beginning. The state doesn't look any longer, and this is something very serious, for serious reasons to conduct this blind repression. They don't want to convince anymore in the legality of their measures. They just want to send a very strong message that any decent opinion would be prosecuted upon, any attempt to manifestate, to defend rights, to run any public activity can bring a lot of personal threats, family threats, and indeed sanctions and imprisonment. The list of human rights center memorial counts now almost 400 political prisoners. And the real number of political prisoners is probably significantly higher. This is just a obviously incomplete list. Some people get murdered and killed, as we know, and a very serious suspicion exists on a state-organized terror, including physical elimination of the opponents of all kinds. And this is precisely for this kind of allegations that Mr. Navalny is now in prison. And of course, the charges against him do not fool anyone. I would like to give one example, which is not the most significant, but this is so speaking. It's an example of Pavel Zielenski, who was a cameraman employed by Alexei Navalny Anti-Corruption Foundation, and who was sent to custody for 2 tweets where he spoke about a journalist, Irina Slavina, who self-immolated herself and died. And even the 2 tweets about this happening brought this person to custody, while no punishment or sanctions were brought against people who forced Mrs. Slavina to commit this absolutely dramatic act. So to conclude, and leave maybe a little bit more time to my colleagues from the field, I would say that even given the history of political repressions in Russia, which is already quite important, we really turned a new page, and this has to get an adequate answer as the level of violence is really gaining the ground every day, and I would even say every hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Kuleva. And now I will pass the floor to Mr. Denis Shedov, legal analyst of OVD Info in Russia. Thank you.
Dear Chair, dear representatives and all participants of this joint meeting, I'm glad to share a view and expertise of OVD Info on the current situation in Russia. OVD Info is the human rights media project aimed at monitoring cases of political persecution and providing victims of such persecution. As it was mentioned, we were founded during mass protest of December 2011 in Russia as a volunteer project. Today, OVD Info operates a 24-hour federal hotline to collect information on all types of political persecution and coordinate legal assistance to its victims, as well as provide legal education to activists and to do researches on political motivated persecution. Sadly, these days our work is especially in demand. I believe that we are facing massive persecution of unprecedented scale. Since January 23rd, more than 11,000 people have been detained by the police for participating in rallies in support of opposition politician Alexei Navalny. The detainees spent from several hours to several days in the police stations. People were threatened with expulsion from educational institutions for participating in the rallies and arrested for spreading information about the protest. The detainees complained about the poor conditions in the police buses during the escorting and in the police station during the detention. They also complained about multiple cases of unjustified use of force during the arrest and physical harm by the police. However, there is no one criminal case against police officers. At the same time, dozens of criminal cases have been initiated against participants of the protest. Participants and organizers of protests are accused of calling for mass riots, involving minors in illegal activities, blocking roads and sidewalks, violating sanitary rules in the context of the pandemic, so-called sanitary case, hooliganism, damage of property, as well as causing physical harm to police officers. Rapidly emerging criminal cases allow not only to prosecute special people, but also provide the authorities with a whole set of tools to further suppress freedom of assembly and civil society. Many people risk being charged with offense that would require minimal effort to prove. This gave the state grounds for searches and calls for interrogations, banning the dissemination of information about the rallies, as well as instrument to marginalize the protest, using the topic of pandemic or people under legal age. Concerns arise around the persecutions of journalists who cover the protest and lawyers who assist detainees. Almost 100 journalists have been detained during the protest during the last almost 3 weeks. For example, it was mentioned also here the case of Smirnov, editor of independent internet outlet Mediazona, is under arrest for the joke in the Twitter. And not only Sergei Smirnov, there are many cases against journalists in Russia these days, and some of them face charged on administrative offense and now are under arrest. What about lawyers? In many, it seems to be something not new, but the trend became more serious scale. In many cases, lawyers who try to help detained people were not allowed in police stations to assist to their clients. Some lawyers have been prosecuted for intending to perform their professional duties. At least I know about at least 2 cases during this protest when lawyers were prosecuted trying helping arrested people in police stations. We are convicted that the participants of rallies must enjoy legal protection of their freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of expression, as well as solidarity and support from the global civil society and all people who share democratic values. And we think that it's necessary to to mobilize all civil society force to help these people. And we try to organize these days legal consulting, legal assisting, and we face many obstacles in the courts because due to the pandemic, it's not possible to obtain courts for visitors, for journalists, for it's also very difficult to obtain courts for lawyers who try to help people, and also we try to provide accurate and detailed information about this protest because there are many official media who, media which are affiliated with the state, who try to marginalize this protest. As I mentioned, using this topic of pandemic and using the topic of involving minorities. Yeah, I would be glad to answer any question if it's necessary. Thank you for attention.
Thank you, Mr. Denis Shedov. I will give the floor now to the EAS, Audron Perkerskien. You have the floor for 3 minutes, and after that I will give the floor to Mr. Kubilius. So 3 minutes for the EAS. Thank you.
Dear chairpersons, honorable members, thank you for the invitation to this very important exchange of views. Let me elaborate briefly on how we see the latest developments and on our policy thinking and action. As we speak, High Representative Borrell is holding consultations with Foreign Minister Lavrov. And besides conveying clear and firm messages, the visit of High Representative to Moscow also serves the purpose of supporting the civil society on the ground and will contribute to the Foreign Affairs Council discussion on Russia on 22nd of February, and later the European Council strategic discussion on Russia in March. Now, briefly regarding the latest developments in Russia. We are witnessing unprecedented developments across Russia, and as eloquently portrayed by both distinguished panelists. People are demanding justice, respect for fundamental freedoms, and change. In contacts with our Russian counterparts, and also publicly, we have repeatedly expressed deep concern regarding numerous measures taken recently by Russia that contribute to the worsening of the situation. We also have condemned the Russian legislation on foreign agents. We have protested publicly against including the European Endowment for Democracy, the Prague Civil Society Center, and the Association of Schools of Political Studies of the Council of Europe on the Russian list of undesirable organizations. Just to recall that until now, 7 EU NGOs have been listed under this undesirable organizations legislation. We are concerned with the legislative changes introduced by Duma at the end of December 2020, imposing new restrictions on freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and access to information. And we are following the developments closely. In a statement published 2 days ago in the Council of Europe, the European Union urged the Russian authorities to ensure full respect for the right of freedom of assembly and the right to freedom of expression as guaranteed by the European Court of Human Rights. We also called on Russia to refrain from taking any disproportionate measures against peaceful protesters as well as journalists. We reiterated our call on the Russian Federation to follow recommendations of the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights. And we urged Russian authorities to immediately release those who have been detained arbitrarily for exercising their right of peaceful assembly. The European Union has consistently called upon the Russian authorities to uphold their national and international obligations to respect and ensure human rights. Now, as regards the case of Mr. Navalny, the European Union, as you know, condemns in the strongest possible terms the assassination attempt of Alexei Navalny. Most recently, on Wednesday this week, High Representative, in his declaration on behalf of All 27 EU member states condemned the Russian authorities' decision to sentence Mr. Navalny and considered it unacceptable as it is politically motivated and runs counter to Russia's international human rights obligations. Now, a few words on support to the civil society in Russia. We have received a mandate from the Foreign Affairs Council in October 2020 to step up our support to the civil society in Russia. And this is right now one of our top priorities in the EU-Russia policy. We raise problems that we see in Russia, both publicly and in our interactions with the Russian authorities. We support civil society financially, and we will continue to do so. Just a few examples. At the moment, the EU is funding 24 new projects in Russia, totaling 11 million euros in the field of human rights and support to civil society. Funding covers topics such as training and capacity building on human rights activists, support to media, freedom of association, fight against torture and any form of discrimination, and many more. Also, since the start of the COVID-19 crisis, the EU has mobilized project partners to protect vulnerable people and those disproportionately affected by COVID-19. A number of non-governmental organizations funded by the EU are already delivering help and assistance to elderly people, women facing domestic violence, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups. To conclude, the EU remains united in its approach towards Russia under the EU's 5 guiding principles, and our unity under these principles is our greatest asset, and we will continue to implement them in a balanced and dynamic way. Thank you.
Thank you. We have some change of the on people having the floor because of the connecting. So we have to give the floor to Isabelle Wissler. Isabelle, tu as la parole.
You have the floor for 1 minute, Isabelle. And thank you, Mr. Kubilius. You'll have the floor in the second round. I apologize for the changes. Isabelle Wissler has the floor.
Is Isabelle Wissler connected? She's no more connected, so okay, so I give the floor. Je donne la parole à Monsieur Kubilius.
In that case, I'll pass the floor to Mr. Kubilius now. He is the AFET Standing Rapporteur on Russia.
Thanks a lot, Madam Chair. Really, I will try to be very brief, and in a very concrete sentences. First of all, what we hear today and during all those days, it reminds me, and I hope all of us, really what was happening 3 months ago when we were discussing Belarus issues. Yesterday we had an informal seminar with something like 10 or 12 representatives from different cities of Russia and also with Belarusian people, and very simple conclusions. Russia is following Belarusian way, with protest, with people demanding change, and also Putin is following Lukashenko with all the brutality and even, the question is who will be more brutal, in the future. And the question is, of course, not only arrest of Navalny or 12,000 arrests which were done during the last days, but I would say that it's a much broader question on forthcoming elections, Duma elections, and if my logic is right, Putin will follow Lukashenko, example, and he will try to steal elections. And that is the most important issue what we shall face. So Navalny is a trigger, but the major problem will be stealing of elections. It's what we discussed also yesterday. It's test also to us. We were not so effective in defending people's right for elections in Belarus, and I am afraid that we are also can be also failing with our efforts to assist Russian people to defend their right for democracy and for elections. So the question is very simple. Can we stop such development which we can predict? Can we react in advance, not only after? That's most important question. And we need to learn some lessons, critical lessons from Belarusian from our efforts to assist Belarus, we need to learn those lessons now, and we need to act. Our statements about concern or solidarity is not enough. So what should be our action? First of all, I should tell in a very simple way. Let's not have any more illusions about Putin. We need to have not 5 principles in our relationships toward Russia, but we need to have one principle: democracy. Democracy first. I'm telling in a very simple way, our philosophy should change from Putin first to philosophy democracy first when we're talking about our relationship with Russia. And let's make democracy also very clear our priority on EU side. Let's take democracy as we took, for example, climate change. Now, that should be our priority also in our transatlantic relations. We have really good changes in Washington, D.C. Let's use those opportunities which now are opening for transatlantic alliance for democracy. We have Belarus, we have Russia, we have China. There is a lot of job where democracies should show that they are able to win the battle for democracy against authoritarian regimes. What we can do, really, sanctions are very important. It's good that we have Magnitsky Act, but when we should look at some time, I ask, Madam Chairwoman, maybe we can have much more deep discussions about how our sanctions mechanism, from instrumental point of view, how that is working. I tried to investigate a little bit about Lithuanian experience, and I was, not convinced that this is the most effective way. We need to have something more centralized, more coordinated, and more effective. We need to look, we need to follow hidden treasures of those regimes. Why not to ask our services to look where, for example, Lukashenko is hiding his treasures? We learned a little bit about Putin's, castle and things like that, but we can look more deeply. And of course, international justice. That is what we need to look really, because in advance, let's be ready that human rights violations in Russia will be really very harsh and very cruel, and that's why we need to be ready for that.
Thank you, Andreas. I give the floor to Tonino Pizzula.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear Maria, I want also to extend thanks to our 3 panelists today. Allow me to start by expressing my confidence that High Representative Borrell will strongly convey our message of condemnation of Mr. Navalny's arrest and sentence, as well as other breaches of human rights. The European Union needs to send a message by not only considering new sanctions, but also by increasing our support to prosecuted, tortured, and repressed voices of the opposition and the civil society. However, this has been a very good week for Mr. Putin. He put his political enemy in prison, and the Russian vaccine was endorsed by a medical journal. With our current vaccination issues, we see more openness of some member states towards the Russian vaccine, which is a great opportunity for Russia to impose further leverage. Therefore, I would like to ask our dear guest speakers questions for all. In your view, what is the best approach to impose new targeted sanctions to Moscow, taking into consideration Putin's elite inner circle? What should we expect from the Foreign Affairs Council? And particularly to Madame Perkelsian, do you see room for cooperation with the new US administration on this issue, as well as with the United Kingdom? Thank you.
Thank you, Tonino. I give the floor, je donne la parole à Bernard Guetta pour...
Give the floor to Bernard Guetta for Renew.
Renew, est-ce que c'est moi en l'occurrence?
Can you hear me? Yes. I wanted to thank Marie and our guests, and I did wanted to follow up that parallel that Mr. Kubilius just made between Russia and Belarus. yes, there are demonstrations in Russia that are similar to the ones in Belarus, but the situation has become very unstable in Russia. But I could add something. In Moscow, as in Minsk, we're seeing the end of a reign, and it may be a long, drawn-out process. It may take years. It might just take a few months, of course, I don't know, but it's a fin de règne, it's an end of a reign. And Mr. Putin's regime is becoming increasingly fragile, both internally and on the international level. At the international level, Mr. Putin has reached a dead end. Both in Syria and in the Ukraine, he's losing control of the former Soviet republics that have become independent states. Living conditions are going down. His popularity figures are falling. So this is a kind of end of a reign. It could be a violent and cruel process, but nevertheless, it's almost certain. Mr. Putin is getting old, and he is losing his grip on Russia. So, yes, targeted sanctions may be a good idea, particularly those responsible for corruption. We certainly should be thinking about Nord Stream 2, thinking very carefully, but with an open mind. And a third factor, which is absolutely essential, and which we haven't brought in mind enough, in politics, words are weapons. So we do need to weigh them carefully. We need, as the European Parliament, to address a clear message to the Russian nation, or rather the nations in the plural, because it's the Russian Federation. We need to tell them very clearly that we, the European Union, are keen to develop a good neighbourly relation of cooperation with the Federation of Russia. And the only problem is that the policies pursued by the President prevent this. We have to feed the hopes of the opposition in Russia.
To Sergei Lagodinsky, you have the floor, Sergei, for the Greens.
Thank you so much, Chair. Nice to see you. A couple of questions. First of all, I think that our solidarity with the civil society and with representatives here is unbroken, and it remains. And I think this was the most important thing to communicate now. A couple of questions to our own foreign affairs services. First of all, supporting civil society in Russia, how do you make sure that you don't endanger organizations in Russia? Because, as you know, they get the stamp of undesired organizations or foreign agents. Number two, I understand, and the colleague said, we should deliver a clear message, etc., etc. We have delivered enough messages. The problem now is that the European Union is increasingly incredible as a foreign policy actor. And it was incredible and looked down by authoritarians. Now we're losing credibility within civil societies. For example, the civil societies in Belarus or Russia that we're discussing now. So how do we make actions, not just words? This is my question. For example, when talking about sanctions, what about the human rights sanctions regime? Why did we discuss this for months? Why is it has not been implemented, for example, vis-a-vis the judges of Alexei Navalny? Are there legal problems there? Are there political problems there? This I would like to hear. Number two, what about Navalny and the visit to Navalny? We had a letter of many members of parliament to Monsieur Borrell. And I understand if it's not possible by the Russian authorities, fine. But what I hear now, what I read now is that Mr. Borrell says it was his conscious choice not to meet with Navalny. I thought I was reading wrong. Is this right? Is this what he said? That they decided not to meet with Navalny during the trip now? So I would like to hear on that. Now, the effectiveness of our actions. Ms. Shevtsova, for example, in Rostov-Don, is facing now 5 years of prison for just being a member of an organization of NGOs. What are we doing there? What is the European Union doing there to submit a message, if you want, on this particular case? And now the last point. If Mr. Borrell went to Moscow, of course, he took some positive agenda. What is the positive agenda that he's taken? And how do we make sure that this positive agenda is not going to sell the negative agenda that we're having and will weaken us instead of strengthen us? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergei. I give the floor to Anna Fotiga from the ECR.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry I have to start with commenting on the statement on behalf of AFET. I hope that what Mrs. Zovko told, that we want stability on the continent similarly to Russian Federation, was just a lapsus linguae, because we have a long list of proofs that it is not the case in terms of Russian Federation. I would say that I listened carefully to joint press conference of Mr. Borrell and Sergei Lavrov, and have many remarks, actually. I would like to say that, of course, we support Russian society. We are friendly towards Russians and other nations that live within Russian Federation. But I think that democracy there is not enough. People should cut themselves from earlier policies of external aggression as well, and very, very clearly so. During press conference, Mrs. Borrell told that he had no agenda of restrictive measures towards Russia in the meeting, because no member state issues this kind of request. I heard something totally different from EEAS press officer earlier, before the visit. So I think there are many issues to be, and my also remark to earlier speakers. I heard energy issues as positive agenda in relationship to Russia. What about Nord Stream 2? In many statements by European Parliament, we voted by large majority to stop Nord Stream 2. It should be taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor, je donne la parole à Isabelle Wissler.
I'll give the floor to Isabelle Wissler. Is Isabelle connected?
Oui, Isabelle.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to start by thanking our expert for the very interesting presentation. Unfortunately, I seem to have been having some connection problems. The European Parliament's always been very firm on the Parliament's duty to defend European rights, European values, democracy and the rule of law. So, we firmly condemn and continue to condemn the situation in Belarus, but also the disproportionate repression of peaceful demonstrators in Russia. Now, in the cases of Russia and Belarus, our actions have been without consequence, it seems. We need to stress the interests of Belarus, not our own interests. Russia continues to threaten reprisals or even military intervention. But we continue to try to appease the Russian authorities. Our responses have not been firm enough. Our economic interests and other interests at the national level always enter into play and render us not fully credible. In the context of the brutal repression in Moscow and the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny, I hope that the reaction from our High Representative will be clear and unequivocal, that you will reassert our position on the human rights and democracy issues, and that you pass on our firm condemnation. We cannot put our head in the sand. The situation in Russia is very alarming, and in the context of all these arrests, I must stress the importance of the fact that hundreds of journalists have been arrested. I'd like to thank the experts for the information we've heard. They did mention this situation. We have to take it very seriously indeed. I call for the new sanctions reform that we've adopted. The European Magnitsky Reform Act should not be simply a dead letter at the bottom of a drawer. This is really the right moment to activate this mechanism.
Santos. On avait le portugais.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank all of the experts who've spoken this morning for the very important information they provided. What's currently happening in Russia is not really news to any of us. It's just one further step on the escalation of Russia's violations of human rights and repression of all opposition. The detention and sentencing of Alexei Navalny seems to be entirely arbitrary. It's on the basis of a previous sentence that had previously been described as arbitrary by the European Court of Human Rights. So we can't be complacent and accept this kind of attitude or this escalation on the part of the Russian authorities. The European Parliament recently adopted a resolution, and we hope that the contents of this resolution will be fully applied rapidly, including the application of sanctions to those who are directly involved in the detention of Mr. Navalny. We cannot simply use mere words. We have understood that for Mr. Putin, words are not important, that we need to take clear sanctions, clear measures. It's not enough to simply call for unconditional release of Mr. Navalny and all of those who were recently arrested. So let's ensure that there is firm action. The time for words has now passed. The time has come to act. We need to activate the new mechanism for sanctions, and we need to ensure it's implemented rapidly. Thank you.
Isabel Petras Ostrevicius, you have the floor.
Hello. Yeah. Madam Chair, thank you so much for having this exchange, and all colleagues who have stepped in this debate. In fact, I have to completely concur with Anna's Fotiga statement on Joseph Borrell's visit to Moscow. His remark that he had no proposal for sanctions, it's wrong. It's not complete. There was a proposal for sanctions. It was made at last Foreign Affairs Council by some member states. And to disregard this political position is, politically very, very risky. I believe on the 22nd or so, 22nd of February, when will be the next Foreign Affairs Council meeting, it will be a bit heated debate on this issue. You know, Navalny's case is a watershed between what we had and what we have. The Putin's regime showed a new face, absolutely brutal, disregarding, disliking civil society. And what happened to hundreds of journalists on those days, it's simply unbelievable. Well, sanctions must be considered, and we have to come with a very tangible set of sanctions, no doubt about this. But again, I completely agree with my colleagues who want to have more contacts with the civil society. Here we should come up with a new program, a new approach. Madam Chair, thank you so much.
Thank you, Petras. I give the floor to Heidi Hautala.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think it's excellent that we have discussions with people like Sasha Kulaeva and Denis Shedov. And I think towards the Duma elections, I think we should have intensely this type of exchanges so that we understand what are the possibilities of the European Parliament and the EU to support the civil society and try to ensure the maximum we can free and fair elections. So don't think I'm naive. I don't think this will happen in September 2021, but we have to try. So I think Mrs. Kulaeva has given a very good description by saying that Navalny is a snapshot on what is happening in the Russian political sphere and civil society now. And I would maybe conclude also that where the repressive measures that we have heard from both are stronger than ever, and also the fatigue with the Putin regime and the resistance is stronger than ever. So this is something that could, of course, lead into major changes in the coming, months, years. Don't know exactly, but I'm sure that President Putin already has 2024 in his mind, and he's also watching what's going on in Belarus. So I just hope that we'll find the best possible ways, and that, for instance, I'd like to hear from Denis Shedov that how can we as European Parliament support journalists who are now persecuted, and what would be your ideas? Do I have 20 seconds or not?
Yeah,
okay.
we have to close because we don't have any translation more after 5 minutes, so I prefer giving the floor to the others.
Well, we'll have a heated debate with Borrell on Tuesday in the European Parliament, by the way.
Thank you. I give the floor to Raphael Glucksmann.
Thank you, Chair. I will be very brief. Of course, we need to be on the side of the civil society, and I want to thank the experts and the activists for the things they have told. And please tell us what to do, and we will be echoing your voice and your request. Now, I have a big issue with the EAS statements. I mean, are we a Twitter account or are we a political power? Because we keep condemning and we keep disagreeing. And we keep saying that, by the way, we also have a positive agenda. So when will it become a policy? I mean, Navalny, when he came himself, virtually to the AFET committee of this parliament, he asked us something. He asked us to strike the regime on the wallet, which means to seize the assets of oligarchs connected to this regime, robbing Russia and spending their money in our nations. So it's time to take action. And it's time also to actually use this mechanism, as my colleagues have said, that is still a piece of paper as we speak. And it's a very, very bad signal to announce in Moscow that there is no restrictive measure in the agenda. When we say that, what we do is we send the message to the Russian regime that actually all our tweets are bullshit. So when will we have a policy, which means measures? Otherwise, it's true, Lagodinsky said it, we will lose all credibility.
Thank you. Merci, Raphael. I give the floor to Alexander Mordanov from AFET, if he's connected.
Mr. Jordanov, please press the speak button. Thank you.
If he's not connected, I give the floor to Bart Groeten. Yeah.
Merci, Madame. I'd like to
Thank you very much.
Because it's hard enough in Dutch, but thank you very much. I'd just like to say I'd like to thank Mr. Glucksmann as well, what he has said on communicating that there is no norm if you condemn and there's no follow-up. Of course, sanctions are a way of saying there should be that this is our follow-up, this is our norm, but we should also be more creative, and I'd like to do that call right here. So there might be, for example, intensive care nurses in St. Petersburg, and we might recruit them in Europe. That might hurt Putin too. We have art exchanges. We have exchanges of students. And what I'd like to see is that the European Union would step up its effort by making it more strategic, better, geopolitical. We should hurt them and hit them where it hurts, and not just Magnitsky-esque, but much more and be much more creative than just this. And that I'd like to echo what Mr. Astrovicius and Mr. Glucksmann have said. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. So I think that we will close the discussion now. We'll give the time to the different experts to answer to some questions before giving the conclusion to my colleague Janina. So I give the floor to the different experts. I think the EAS has received a lot of questions. So first to the EAS and after to both other experts. So you have the floor for the answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for your comments and questions. Regarding the EU global human rights sanctions regime, I would like to remind that it indeed provides for measures such as travel ban, assets freeze, and prohibition to make funds available to those listed. And discussions on proposals for listings under this future new human rights sanctions regime are ongoing. And I cannot speculate here and now on who would be listed, as this is subject to a council decision and a council decision by unanimity. I am sure that the European Union will revert to a number of issues raised here today at the upcoming Foreign Affairs Council on 22nd of February and will discuss implications of recent developments and possible further actions. Now, when it comes to question on contacts with US and UK, our contacts with US and UK continue on working and also on political level. High Representative spoke to US Secretary of State Blinken earlier this week, and more high-level contacts are in the pipeline. A very important question regarding support to civil society. Russia legislation's aim is precisely to limit our capacity to support civil society organizations in Russia. And despite that, we continue to support that. And despite that, civil society organizations in Russia that are brave and creative are still very much willing to receive our support. And we are currently assessing the best ways so that not to expose them to any repressions. And I can assure you that we have instruments under the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights and other instruments that I do not want to discuss in details publicly that allow us to support them and not harm their interests. I would like to also underline that the EAS is at your disposal for sharing more information on our support in a more restrictive format if needed. On calls to be more creative, we also are stepping up support not only to civil society, but also to people. And having in mind that we do not have enough time, I will give you just very few examples. For example, in this context, Russian students are the largest beneficiaries of Erasmus Plus program of study in EU universities outside the EU, while Russian citizens are also the biggest recipients of Schengen visas. So these are only a few examples of support to people. And the last point from my side regarding High Representative's mission, it is ongoing now as we speak. High Representative will still have a number of meetings in Moscow later today. So it would be premature for me to comment on his mission now. And as rightly mentioned, High Representative will brief European Parliament in the plenary meeting on Tuesday himself next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we understand that we will have this debate during the plenary also and during the the following up of this mission. So I give the floor to Sasha Kuleva, for 1 minute, if you can answer to some questions.
Thank you very much. I will try to fit into 1 minute time. I would like to comment on three things very, very briefly. First of all, I am very thankful to this debate. I think it should be continued. I also think that I'm also grateful for the mentioning of Belarus, the situation which remains absolutely in the center of our preoccupations. But I would like to avoid maybe the parallels between the situation in Russia and in Belarus, but rather the acknowledgement of the fact that Putin's regime is a full actor in what is happening in Belarus too. It's not two separated situations. The Belarusian situation would not be where it is now if Putin's regime wouldn't back fully Lukashenko, and probably President Lukashenko won't be there if Putin was not there. I also want to underline a very important point, which is a smoke screen strategy of both Putin and Lukashenko regime. We see that they follow when the international attention goes to one to another, to use this momentum to advance certain things. And within 3 last days, when all the international attention switched from Belarus to Russia, human rights defenders in Belarus are massively arrested. Yesterday, our colleagues from Office for People with Disabilities were arrested, including their director in the wheelchair. And probably this wouldn't happen if the spotlight wouldn't switch to Russia. So I would greatly encourage you not to lose your attention, which I know is great, to what is happening in Belarus, because it's also part of the question of Russia and Putin's regime. It's not just a question of Belarus, it goes together. And finally, I would like to underline that with Navalny, it's almost the same smokescreen strategy again, because now we are discussing whether his detention was legitimate or not, or even the process, because today is another process against Navalny happening. But all this in the same tent of smoking screen made disappear the discussions that actually he was attempted to be assassinated, and he was one of dozens of activists who probably were targeted by this assassination attempts, with a headquarters, from what we read in the media now, based in France, in European Union. And this is a question of an absolute emergency, which should not disappear behind the huge debate about the fate of one person, however important this person is and however important his situation right now is. And finally, about the security concerns, which I share and totally back, I want to say that for people in such a desperate situation as the Russian civil society, we can't do more harm than not to show the solidarity. All the measures which are now conducted, including the foreign agents law, which is now applicable to physical persons, which means that I send a Christmas present to someone in Russia, it can be believed as a foreign help, are directed to cut civil society from international community, from you, from Western support from all over the world. And we should not drop into this trap. We should continue to show the solidarity. We should stand with people, because there is no more poisoning solution than to, in the terms of and in the sake of security, weaken the pressure on the government in support of the civil society. We speak a lot about the shrinking space. You should acknowledge that in Russia, the civil society space is shrank. It is not shrinking. The only thing we can still do for this civil society is a very active measures, very active statements, because statements also matter if it goes beyond the preoccupations, if it really states the things they are. Thank you.
Thank you. So finally, I give the floor to Dennis. If you have 1 minute, we just have it in English because we lose our translation. So if you can do it in English, I think it's not a problem for you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you a lot for this discussion. I also would like to, I totally agree with my colleague and previous speaker, Sasha Gulaeva, and I would like to highlight maybe some points. First of all, about legal aid, legal help. We try to provide legal assistance for people who face repression in Russia, and mostly we can hope only for some international human rights institution like European Court for Human Rights or Human Rights Council of UN or so on. And some of these institutions allow for the third parties provide some expertise, some opinions, and maybe this instrument could be used. But the second question is how to implement of the decision and opinions of this international institution, human rights institution in Russia. It's really big problem due to the new amendment in our constitution, but it's still possible. And we also, me and my colleagues and other members of Russian civil society, try to do it, and we also are open to communicate maybe some joint action in this way. And what about journalists? It's really big problem for Russia in general, but now it's the scale of this problem is extremely high, and I think it could be useful some individual measures for people who face it, for journalists who face it persecution, as well as some measures to provide journalists with maybe some platforms for their voicing and so on. Yeah. Thanks a lot for this discussion.
Thank you, Denis Shedov, and thank you for your work. We know that your position in Moscow is not easy at all, and so you are risking also a lot in your country. We stay in contact with you and tell us about your difficulties in your country, and we will make the follow-up here at the European Parliament. It's also important for us to keep this link with organizations like yours in your country, fighting for democracy and for the freedom of speech in your country. So thank you for your work. I give the floor to Janina to close and to make the conclusion of this meeting. It is just the conclusion of the meeting, not the conclusion of our work on the situation of Russia, in Russia, and of course in all the countries where Russia has something to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Arena. And first, before I go to concluding remarks, just to clarify the situation to Madame Fotyga, because of the absence of Richard Czarnecki, who is from your group, ECR, I read his speaking notes, so in order not to be really misrepresented, ECR, so you can ask for the explanation from Mr. Czarnecki on what he meant by these statements. And now I will follow on the mind that I proofread. Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank all our guests for this very interesting debate. The situation in Russia is extremely worrying. Just as in Belarus, the authorities are using the harshest means and tactics to quash peaceful protests. As we heard, political leaders, activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens are being convicted on the basis of dubious or fabricated charges. Some of them are under arrest because of reposts on social media. Criminal justice is being used as a political weapon, and it's becoming by the day more arbitrary. But colleagues, there is a good news too. The protests in Russia, like the ones in Belarus, are the evidence on the birth of a new, young, peaceful and politically conscious society. And we in the EU should use all tools available to us to support the Russian society in its struggle for a better and more democratic future. Since December, we have our Magnitsky Act. We should immediately use it in order to punish all those responsible of human rights violations in Russia and elsewhere. As a European Parliament, we will continue to keep a close eye on the situation, and we will make sure that the respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms will feature prominently in the new EU strategy on Russia. We will start to convey this message next week in the plenary debate with Mr. Borrell, and will continue with the report steered by Mr. Kubilius, which will indicate all the tenets of this new strategy. I count on your cooperation and support. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you, and have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Sorry.